The medical record appeared on my desk, though I had locked my office door. The patient's name had been redacted, but the diagnosis was still legible: afflicted with visions of the other side. New York shivered under November rain in 1923, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes old injuries ache. The city's perpetual din provided a comforting background as I hunched over my desk at the New York Herald, surrounded by stacks of notes and newspaper clippings. My editor had assigned me what he called a curiosity piece about abandoned buildings in Manhattan. But what began as a mundane assignment had led me down a rabbit hole I couldn't escape. You won't believe what happened when I visited the hospital that the church tried to erase from history. Watch until the end. The building that captured my attention stood on the corner of 44th and Lexington, St. Augustine's Memorial Hospital. Constructed in 1871, it had been abruptly closed in 1897 and remained shuttered ever since. Property records showed it was still owned by the Catholic Diocese of New York, yet the church never mentioned it in any official capacity. In fact, when I contacted the diocese for comment, the secretary insisted no such hospital had ever existed, despite the building's cornerstone clearly bearing its name. I'm Thomas Reynolds, 32 years old, divorced, and too curious for my own good. That's what my ex-wife used to say before she left. Tommy, one day your questions will lead you somewhere you can't return from. I'd laughed then. I wasn't laughing anymore. My investigation began 3 weeks ago with a tip from Gerald Winters, a city records clerk I'd befriended during previous research. He'd called me to his cramped basement office, eyes darting nervously as he slid a yellowed folder across his desk. Found this misfiled in the architectural archives, he'd whispered, though we were alone. It's not supposed to exist. All records of this place were ordered destroyed in 1898 by Mayor Van Wyck himself. The folder contained partial blueprints of St. Augustine's, along with fragmentary correspondence between the hospital's last director, Dr. Edwin Caldwell, and Archbishop Michael Corrigan. The final letter, dated October 17, 1897, contained just one line: "For the sake of all souls, it must be closed and forgotten." Most journalists would have seen an opportunity for a sensational story, but I sensed something deeper. Why would the church and city government collaborate to erase a hospital from public memory? What had happened there? The more I researched, the more walls I encountered. Former employees refused to speak with me. Public records concerning the hospital had vanished. The few medical journals that mentioned St. Augustine's had those pages torn out. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury its history. Then yesterday, I'd finally found a lead. An obituary from 1898 mentioned Dr. Sarah Montgomery, who had worked at St. Augustine's until its closure. The article noted she had relocated to a small practice in Brooklyn. A few telephone calls revealed that Dr. Montgomery had died in 1921, but her daughter, Catherine, still lived in her mother's brownstone in Park Slope. Catherine Montgomery was a severe woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that evaluated me thoroughly before inviting me in. Her parlor smelled of camphor and lemon polish, everything in perfect order. Mother rarely spoke of St. Augustine's, she said, pouring tea into delicate cups, but when she did, it was always with a certain, dread. Dread, I repeated, accepting the offered cup. Catherine nodded. She would wake, screaming some nights. I once heard her tell my father that the hospital had too many rooms on the inside. When I asked what she meant, she forbade me from ever mentioning it again. Did she leave any records? Journals, perhaps? Catherine studied me for a long moment before setting down her cup. Why are you so interested in a hospital that closed 26 years ago, Mr. Reynolds? I gave her my practiced response about historical documentation and architectural preservation. She didn't believe me. I could tell from the slight narrowing of her eyes, but she disappeared into another room nonetheless, returning with a small leather-bound journal. Mother left instructions that this be burned upon her death, she said, running a finger along its worn spine. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Perhaps I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The journal detailed Sarah Montgomery's experiences as a resident physician at St. Augustine's from 1895 to 1897. The early entries described routine medical procedures and hospital politics. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed dramatically. August 14, 1896, patient in room 408 claims to see people in the walls, the same delusion as the patient last month and the one before that, always room 408. September 23, 1896. Nurse Collins disappeared during her night shift, the third staff member to vanish this year, Dr. Caldwell insists she simply quit without notice, but her belongings remain in her locker. October 7, 1896. The new wing defies logic. I counted the steps between wards twice today. The distance keeps changing. December 18, 1896. The patients in the East Wing all report the same dream. They describe a figure in white who watches them from the foot of their beds. None of them know of the old hospital legend about the waiting woman. The final entry, dated October 15, 1897, sent a chill down my spine. God forgive us for what we've done. We built this hospital to heal, but we've opened a door that should have remained closed. I now understand what the patients meant when they said they could see the other side. There is something in the walls, something that watches, something that waits. 2 days later, the hospital was closed by order of the Archbishop, all patients transferred to other facilities, and the staff dispersed with generous pensions and strict confidentiality agreements. Did your mother ever elaborate on these entries? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Catherine shook her head. She would only say that medicine couldn't explain everything that happened there. She was a woman of science, Mr. Reynolds, not given to superstition. Whatever she experienced at St. Augustine's changed her. I borrowed the journal with a promise to return it within the week. Back in my office, I studied it late into the night, cross-referencing the entries with my other research. Around midnight, I dozed off at my desk, only to jerk awake at the sound of rustling paper. The medical record that now lay before me, the one I hadn't brought in, the one that couldn't possibly be there, was dated October 1897, the month the hospital closed. The patient's description noted recurring visions of figures emerging from walls and insistence that rooms change dimensions when unobserved. At the bottom of the page was a note in flowing script I didn't recognize. Mr. Reynolds, if you wish to understand St. Augustine's, you must see it for yourself. Some doors remain open even when we try to close them. I looked up sharply, certain someone else was in my office. The room was empty, but in the moment before I turned on my lamp, I could have sworn I saw a figure in white standing in the corner, watching me with eyes that reflected no light. Tomorrow, I decided, I would visit St. Augustine's Memorial Hospital myself. Some questions can only be answered firsthand, no matter the cost. The corridor stretched impossibly long before me, though the building's exterior dimensions couldn't possibly contain it. When I turned to look back, the entrance had vanished. Dawn broke reluctantly over New York City as I made my way to St. Augustine's. The rain had stopped, but a thick fog clung to the streets, muffling sounds and transforming familiar landmarks into looming shadows. The kind of morning where the boundary between worlds feels paper-thin. Have you ever felt like a place was watching you? Tell me in the comments below. St. Augustine's stood 5 stories tall, its once grand Victorian facade now weathered and stained. Boards covered most windows, though several on the upper floors were broken, leaving dark openings like missing teeth in a skull's grimace. The main entrance was chained and padlocked, with a faded sign warning trespassers of prosecution. I circled the building twice, notebook in hand, documenting architectural details while searching for a way in. The imposing structure seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Despite the awakening city around it, the hospital remained shrouded in its own private darkness. On my third circuit, I noticed something odd, a basement window with its boards recently removed. The opening was small, but a man of my build could squeeze through with some effort. I glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then lowered myself into the darkness. The basement smelled of mildew and something medicinal that had soured with age. My flashlight beam cut through darkness thick as tar, revealing a storage area filled with broken furniture and rusted equipment. Dust covered everything except... I paused, moving my light back, a clear set of footprints leading toward a doorway. Someone had been here recently. Not a vagrant or thrill-seeker, the prints showed polished shoes, not boots or worn soles. Professional footwear. I followed the trail up a narrow staircase to the main floor. Here, time had been less destructive. The reception area retained its marble floors and ornate woodwork, though water damage stained the ceiling. Behind the curved reception desk, patient ledgers lay open, as if the hospital had been evacuated in haste. I approached the nearest book, expecting the pages to be blank or damaged beyond legibility. Instead, crisp handwriting detailed patient admissions from October 1897, the hospital's final month. The last entry was dated October 17th, the day before closure. The patient's name was smudged, but the attending physician was listed as Dr. Edwin Caldwell, the hospital's director. The diagnosis contained a single word, transcendence. A soft sound, like fabric brushing against wood, made me look up sharply. At the end of the corridor leading from reception, a white shape disappeared around a corner. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. "I'm a reporter. I'm just here to..." No response, but the sensation of being observed intensified. I walked toward where I'd seen the figure, finding myself in a long hallway lined with examination rooms. Shafts of grey light filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating motes of dust that seemed to hang motionless in the air. Room 108, 110, 112. Each door stood partially open, revealing overturned examination tables and scattered instruments. Nothing unusual for an abandoned hospital, yet something felt wrong. The proportions were off somehow, the rooms too deep, the ceiling slightly too high. At the end of the corridor, a metal sign indicated the East Wing, where Dr. Montgomery's journal had noted the most disturbing incidents. I pushed through the double doors, wincing at their shriek of protest. Beyond lay another corridor, this one darker than the first. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness. As I advanced, I counted my steps, remembering the journal's mention of distances that changed. 20 steps, 40, 60. I stopped. According to the exterior dimensions I'd observed, I should have reached the building's outer wall by now. Yet the corridor stretched on, identical doors lining both sides. I turned to look back. The doors I'd come through were no longer visible, just more corridor, more doors, stretching into darkness. A jolt of panic surged through me. I was no longer certain which direction I'd come from. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. Buildings don't change shape. There must be a logical explanation, a turn I'd taken without noticing, perhaps. I tried the nearest door, locked, as was the next, and the next. On the fourth attempt, the knob turned. The room beyond was an operating theater, surprisingly intact. Tiered seating surrounded a central operating table, still draped with stained sheets. Medical instruments lay arranged on a nearby tray, not rusted as they should be after 26 years of abandonment, but gleaming as if recently polished. Most disturbing was the large mirror positioned to reflect the operating table. Its surface was covered with a black cloth, secured with tape around the edges. Written on the cloth in red ink was a warning, "Do not remove." Against my better judgment, I approached the mirror. The fabric covering it moved slightly. as if disturbed by a draught. Though the air in the room was completely still, my hand reached for the edge of the cloth. As a journalist, I'd built my career on uncovering what others had hidden. What could be so terrible about a mirror that someone felt compelled to cover it and warn others away? Before I could pull the fabric aside, a reflection appeared in a small uncovered corner of the glass. Not my own face, but that of a gaunt man in physician's attire, watching me with hollow eyes. I spun around. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the corner had darkened again. But now a soft whisper filled the room, seemingly emanating from all directions at once. "We've been waiting for you, Mr. Reynolds." I backed toward the door, my rational mind fighting against primal fear. The voice was just an auditory hallucination, I told myself, the product of suggestion and this unsettling environment. But then my flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by thin shafts of light from between the boarded windows. In that near darkness, I saw movement near the operating table. A figure in white, tall and unnaturally thin, standing perfectly still, the waiting woman of hospital legend. I fumbled for the door handle, found it, and burst back into the corridor, only to freeze in confusion. The hallway had changed. Where there had been identical doors stretching into darkness, there was now a nurse's station and a different arrangement of rooms. A sign on the wall read Ward 4. According to Dr. Montgomery's journal, this was where patients reported seeing people in the walls. I checked my watch. 10:17 a.m. I'd entered the hospital just after 7 or how had 3 hours passed so quickly? From somewhere nearby came the unmistakable sound of a hospital gurney being wheeled across tile aisle, its wheels squeaking rhythmically. Then a door closing, then silence. "Hello?" I called again, despising the tremor in my voice. "Is someone there?" A door at the end of the hall, room 408, slowly swung open. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find my way out of this impossible building. Yet I found myself moving forward, drawn by the journalist's curse of needing to know to understand. Room 408 was a standard patient room with a single bed, side table and chair. Sunlight streamed through an unboarded window, revealing dust particles dancing in the air. Nothing unusual, except for the patient chart hanging at the foot of the bed. The name on the chart was Thomas Reynolds, my name. The admission date was tomorrow's date. Scrawled across the bottom in handwriting, I recognized from the mysterious medical record that had appeared on my desk. "The doctor will see you soon." The door swung shut behind me with a soft click of the latch. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. Trapped, I turned back toward the room and found I was no longer alone. A man in a doctor's white coat stood by the window, his back to me. He was unnaturally tall and thin, his head nearly touching the ceiling. "Dr. Caldwell," I guessed, recalling the hospital director's name. The figure slowly began to turn. The corridor stretched impossibly long before me, though the building's exterior dimensions couldn't possibly contain it. When I turned to look back, the entrance had vanished. The nurse's uniform was pristine white, though her face seemed to shift between youth and age when I tried to focus on her features. "The doctor doesn't like to be kept waiting," she said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. I blinked, and the tall figure was gone. In his place stood an empty hospital bed. Sheets rumpled as if recently vacated. My heart pounded so violently I could feel it in my fingertips. I tried the door again. It opened easily now, revealing yet another corridor I didn't recognize. Has your mind ever played tricks on you? Have you ever seen something that couldn't possibly be there? Share your experience below. I had to find my way out. The hospital was playing with my perception, and I feared what might happen if I remained too long. I chose a direction at random and began walking briskly, fighting the sensation that the walls were watching me. Rounding a corner, I collided with a woman in a nurse's uniform. She steadied herself against the wall, then looked at me with disapproval. "Mr. Reynolds, you shouldn't be wandering the halls," she said, as if I were a patient rather than an intruder. "You'll miss your appointment." Her uniform was not aged or dusty, but crisp and perfectly white. Her cap sat atop carefully pinned dark hair, and a name tag read Nurse Patterson. Unlike the figure I'd glimpsed earlier, she appeared solid and real, yet something subtle was wrong. Her movement seemed too smooth, and when she turned her head, I could have sworn her features momentarily blurred. "I'm not a patient," I insisted, backing away. "I'm a reporter. I'm investigating the history of this hospital." She tilted her head at an angle that seemed just slightly beyond normal range of motion. "Saint Augustine's has a long history of treating those who see things others cannot. Dr. Caldwell specializes in such cases." "This hospital has been closed for 26 years, I said, my back now against the wall. Nurse Patterson smiled, revealing teeth too perfect and white. "Time works differently here, Mr. Reynolds. Surely you've noticed." Before I could respond, a bell chimed somewhere in the building, 3 soft notes that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. "That's the doctor's signal," she said. "He's ready for you now, room 512. "I'm not going anywhere except out of this building," I said firmly. Her expression didn't change, but the temperature in the corridor dropped noticeably. "No one leaves St. Augustine's without the doctor's discharge. Mr. Reynolds, those are the rules." She gestured down the hallway, where an elevator stood with its doors open, though I was certain it hadn't been there moments before. The brass indicator above it pointed to 5. "As room 512, she repeated. "The doctor doesn't like to be kept waiting." With those words, she turned and walked away, her footsteps making no sound on the tile floor. At the end of the corridor, she didn't turn, but simply ceased to be there. I stood frozen, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Was she a hallucination, some kind of projected image? Or was I losing my grip on reality, just as the patients in Dr. Montgomery's journal had? The elevator waited, doors open like a mouth. I knew I should find the stairs, find my way back to the basement window and escape. Yet something compelled me forward. The same curiosity that had led me here, now sharpened by a need to understand what was happening. The elevator interior was lined with polished wood and brass fixtures, immaculately maintained. When I stepped inside, the doors closed silently and the car began to ascend without my touching the controls. As the elevator rose, I noticed something odd about its ceiling. A small circular mirror, angled to allow occupants to see who waited in the hallway when the doors opened. In it, I could see the reflection of the elevator's roof, and standing atop it, peering down through the mirror, was a gaunt face with hollow eyes. I looked up at the actual ceiling, solid with no opening or window. When I checked the mirror again, the face was gone. The elevator stopped at the 5th floor, doors opening to reveal a hallway that looked nothing like the dilapidated state of the lower floors. Here, everything was pristine, polished floors, fresh paint, electric lights glowing warmly in wall sconces. It looked as if the hospital was still in operation, untouched by 26 years of abandonment. Room 512 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. As I approached, I heard voices from within, a man and a woman speaking too quietly for me to make out the words. I hesitated, then knocked lightly. The voices stopped immediately. "Come in, Mr. Reynolds," called a man's voice, cultured, authoritative, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't identify. I pushed the door open to find a well-appointed office rather than a patient room. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with medical texts and journals. A large desk dominated the space, behind which sat a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating grey eyes. A brass nameplate identified him as Dr. Edwin Caldwell, medical director. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. "We have much to discuss." "You can't be Caldwell," I said, remaining standing. "He would be over 90 years old now, if he's even still alive." The man smiled, and as Nurse Patterson may have mentioned, time works differently within these walls. "Please, sit. You've been seeking answers about St. Augustine's. I'm prepared to provide them." Against my better judgment, I sat, placing my notebook on my lap. "St. Augustine's was founded with a unique purpose," Caldwell began, folding his hands on the desk. "Not merely to heal the body, but to explore the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms. The church funded our research initially, believing it might provide empirical evidence of the soul." "Research into what, exactly?" I asked, pen poised. "The membrane between worlds, Mr. Reynolds, the thin veil that separates what you perceive as reality from everything else." His eyes never left mine as he spoke. "We discovered that certain individuals, those diagnosed with particular mental conditions, weren't ill at all. They simply perceived what others could not." I thought of the patient records. "Afflicted with visions of the other side. What others could not, or should not?" I asked. Caldwell's smile deepened. "Precisely the right question. We found that when multiple sensitive individuals were gathered in one location, the membrane thinned, and with the right procedures, it could be penetrated." A chill ran through me. "You experimented on patients." "We offered them transcendence," he corrected. The opportunity to exist beyond the limitations of the physical world. Some went willingly, others required persuasion." I glanced toward the door, calculating my chances of reaching it before he could intercept me. "You're not in danger, Mr. Reynolds," Caldwell said, as if reading my thoughts. "Not in the way you imagine. I invited you here because you possess the sensitivity we seek. You've felt it your whole life, haven't you? The sense that what others accept as reality is merely a fraction of what exists." He was right, though I'd never admitted it to anyone. Throughout my life, I'd experienced moments where reality seemed to slip, brief glimpses of places that couldn't exist, faces watching from empty rooms, voices with no source. "The membrane has been thinning again," Caldwell continued. "The church thought they closed the door by shutting down St. Augustine's, but they merely removed the controls. Now it opens randomly, unpredictably. We need someone to document what comes through. A journalist, perhaps, someone who can tell the story properly." "You're saying the hospital is, what, a portal?" "A threshold," he corrected. "One of several throughout the world. Normally, they're stable, allowing minimal transfer between realms. But this one was modified by our work. It became more permeable, and what waits on the other side grows increasingly eager to cross over." From outside, the office came the squeaking sound of a gurney being wheeled down the hall, followed by a moan that didn't sound entirely human. "What exactly comes through?" I asked, my journalistic instincts battling with growing dread. Instead of answering, Caldwell opened a drawer and removed a folder. "These are the original blueprints for St. Augustine's. Not the public plans, but the true design." He spread them on the desk. The drawings showed a building constructed according to complex geometrical principles, with certain rooms positioned at precise angles and distances from each other. Overlaid on the plans were symbols I recognized from esoteric texts, symbols associated with summoning and binding. "The hospital was built as a machine," Caldwell explained. "A device to thin the membrane between worlds. The church believed it would reveal heaven. They didn't consider that other realms might be waiting to be discovered, or that those realms might take an interest in us." "If what you're saying is true, why tell me?" I asked. Why not just let me leave with my wild story that no one will believe?" Caldwell's expression darkened. "Because you can't leave, Mr. Reynolds. No one who truly sees St. Augustine's ever truly leaves it behind. Even now, part of you remains here, will always remain here. He stood and walked to a window that should have shown the street below, but instead revealed a landscape I didn't recognize, a city similar to New York, but with architecture that defied physics, under a sky where several moons of different colors hung impossibly close. "Boo-boo, what you're experiencing isn't madness," Caldwell said. "It's clarity. The membrane between worlds has become so thin that you're perceiving both simultaneously. Few minds can process such duality without breaking." A knock at the door interrupted him. The nurse I'd encountered earlier entered without waiting for a response. "Doctor, it's time for Mr. Reynolds' procedure," she said, her voice now carrying an undertone that echoed strangely. "Yes, of course," Caldwell nodded. "Mr. Reynolds, if you'll accompany Nurse Patterson to the treatment room, we can begin the process of helping you. Adjust to your new perceptions." I stood abruptly, knocking over my chair. "I'm not undergoing any procedure. I'm leaving now," Caldwell sighed. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You crossed the threshold the moment you entered St. Augustine's. Your physical body may depart, but your consciousness is already entangled with this place." As if to emphasize his point, the room briefly shimmered around us, the solid walls becoming transparent for a moment, revealing the dilapidated, abandoned office beneath the illusion of pristine condition. "Well, you see," Caldwell gestured to the momentary glimpse of reality, "you're already between worlds. The procedure merely stabilizes the transition, prevents your mind from fracturing under the strain." The nurse approached with a syringe in hand, her movements fluid yet somehow wrong, as if she were being puppeteered by invisible strings. "Dodai, the choice, Mr. Reynolds, is not whether to undergo the procedure," Caldwell said gently. "It's whether to emerge from it with your sanity intact. Many have resisted. You've read Dr. Montgomery's journal. You know what happened to them." The nurse's uniform was pristine white, though her face seemed to shift between youth and age when I tried to focus on her features. "The doctor doesn't like to be kept waiting," she said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "I saw my reflection in every window of the hospital as I fled, but it wasn't running. It was watching me with a bemused smile, as if it knew something I didn't." In that moment of distraction, as the nurse approached with the syringe, I made my decision. I lunged past her, knocking the syringe from her hand and bolting through the door. Her cry of surprise followed me into the corridor, a sound that warped midway into something inhuman, a high, keening note that made the air vibrate. "Seize him!" Caldwell's voice boomed with unnatural resonance, seeming to come from the walls themselves. "Uti mustn't leave before the procedure. Have you ever had a nightmare where you're running but can't escape? Tell me about it in the comments." I sprinted down the corridor, searching frantically for stairs, an elevator, any way down and out. The pristine hospital surroundings flickered around me, momentarily revealing the decaying reality beneath, peeling paint, broken fixtures, dust and debris, before snapping back to the illusion of a functioning hospital. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Too many, too fast, too rhythmically synchronized to be human. I didn't dare look back. At the end of the hall, I found a door marked "Emergency Stairs" and shoved through it. The stairwell beyond was concrete and utilitarian, lit by bare bulbs that flickered erratically. I began to descend, taking the steps two at a time, the slap of my shoes against concrete echoing in the enclosed space. The door above crashed open. Glancing up, I glimpsed figures in white, not just the nurse, but several orderlies with blank, identical faces, moving with the same unsettling fluidity. They didn't run, but descended with a measured pace, as if certain I couldn't escape. I reached the fourth floor landing and continued down, third floor, second. The stairwell should have taken me to the ground floor next, but instead, I found myself facing a door marked "Basement, Authorized Personnel Only." Had I miscounted? No time to wonder. I pushed through the door into darkness, broken only by the dim red glow of an exit sign. The basement. This must be near where I'd entered. If I could find that window. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was in an area I hadn't seen before. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled not with supplies but with specimen jars. In each floated what appeared to be human organs, hearts, lungs, brains, but deformed, changed in ways that defied biological understanding. Some pulsed gently in their preservative fluid, as if still alive. At the far end of the room stood another door, with light spilling from beneath it. Voices murmured beyond, not the pursuers from upstairs, but something else. I crept closer, torn between the need to find an exit and morbid curiosity about what other secret St. Augustine's held. Through a small, wire-reinforced window in the door, I could see an operating theater similar to the one I'd discovered earlier. This one was occupied. A team in surgical attire surrounded a table where a patient lay draped in white. Their backs were to me, obscuring my view of the procedure, but their movements were precise and coordinated, too coordinated, as if they were extensions of a single consciousness rather than individual surgeons. One turned slightly, giving me a glimpse of the patient's face. I stifled a gasp. It was my own face, eyes open but vacant, expression serene. Yet I was here, watching, fully conscious. How could I also be there? "Reality bifurcates for those who perceive too much," came Caldwell's voice from directly behind me. I spun around. The doctor stood just feet away, though I hadn't heard him approach. His form seemed less solid now, edges blurring slightly as if he were partially transparent. "What you're seeing is possibility, not certainty," he continued. "One version of yourself already submitted to the procedure. Another still resists. Both exist simultaneously until observation collapses the wave function, so to speak." "This isn't quantum physics," I said, backing away. "This is madness." "Is it?" He tilted his head. "The greatest minds in physics are just beginning to understand what we discovered decades ago. Reality isn't fixed. Consciousness shapes it, defines it, sometimes even creates it." He gestured to the scene beyond the door. "That version of you chose understanding. He will become like us, a custodian of the threshold, existing in both worlds simultaneously." A hand grasped my shoulder from behind. Nurse Patterson, her face now barely maintaining human appearance, features shifting like smoke. "But the doctor doesn't like to be kept waiting," she repeated, her voice overlapping with itself in discordant echoes. I tore away from her grip and ran deeper into the basement labyrinth. Behind me, neither Caldwell nor the nurse gave chase. They merely watched, confident in my inevitable capture. The basement corridors twisted in ways that defied the building's logical structure, sometimes narrowing until I had to turn sideways to pass, sometimes opening into cavernous spaces filled with antiquated medical equipment. The air grew colder, damper, with the distinct smell of river water, though we were nowhere near the Hudson. Finally, I rounded a corner and saw daylight, the broken basement window through which I'd entered, now seeming miles away from where I'd first found myself in the building. I sprinted toward it, expecting at any moment to feel hands grasping at me from behind. No one stopped me. I reached the window, pulled myself up and through, tumbling onto the sidewalk outside. The ordinary sounds of New York enveloped me. Car horns, distant voices, the rumble of the elevated train. Normal, real. I stood shakily, brushing dirt from my clothes, and looked back at St. Augustine's looming facade. From outside, it appeared exactly as it had before, an abandoned building slowly decaying, nothing more. Had I hallucinated the entire experience? Was Caldwell right? Was I one of those sensitive individuals, perceiving what others could not? Or perhaps there had been some kind of gas leak in the old hospital, causing vivid hallucinations. I checked my watch, 5:47 p.m. I'd entered around 7 a.m. Nearly 11 hours lost to whatever had happened inside. My rational mind scrambled for explanations as I walked briskly away from St. Augustine's, not daring to look back. Gas leak, hallucination, overwork and suggestion leading to a vivid waking dream. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that I had fabricated the entire ordeal. Then I saw my reflection in the hallway mirror. It didn't move when I did. It watched me, head slightly tilted, with that same bemused smile I'd glimpsed in the hospital windows. I fled into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the key in the lock. I needed to document everything before I forgot, or before I convinced myself it wasn't real. I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd carried into St. Augustine's, and opened it to record my experience. The pages were filled with writing, my handwriting, but not my words. The procedure was successful. Integration with the threshold consciousness requires approximately 72 hours for completion. During this time, the subject may experience reality fluctuations, temporal discontinuity, and perception of alternative versions of self. These are normal adjustment symptoms. Full integration will occur on November 17, 1923 at 11:07 p.m. At that time, the subject will return to St. Augustine's Memorial Hospital to assume duties as assistant to Dr. Edwin Caldwell. This document serves as the official medical record of Thomas Reynolds, the newest custodian of the threshold between worlds. The date listed for my integration was 3 days from now. I dropped the notebook as if it had burned me. This couldn't be happening. I hadn't undergone any procedure. I'd escaped, hadn't I? I ran to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. When I looked up at the mirror, my reflection behaved normally again, mimicking my movements exactly. Just my imagination, stress and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror that didn't correspond to my own. I whirled back. For just a moment, I saw not my face, but Dr. Caldwell's, his eyes meeting mine with cold satisfaction. Then my own reflection returned, pale and terrified. Over the next 3 days, I barricaded myself in my apartment, covering all mirrors and reflective surfaces. I called my editor and claimed illness, then sat down to type out everything that had happened, everything I could remember. As I worked, I noticed gaps in my recollection, entire hours inside the hospital that I couldn't account for. Had something happened during those missing hours? Had I actually undergone Caldwell's procedure without realizing it? I began to notice other disturbances. Sometimes objects weren't where I'd left them. One day, I found myself suddenly in the kitchen with no memory of walking there from my desk. Twice, I heard my typewriter clicking in the night, though I was in bed. On the third day, November 17th, I awoke to find new pages added to my manuscript, describing in clinical detail the process of threshold consciousness integration. The typewriter ribbon was worn in a way that suggested hours of use, though I'd been asleep. At sunset, I felt an irresistible pull towards St. Augustine's. Some part of me, growing stronger by the hour, wanted to return, to complete whatever process had begun. I fought the urge, pacing my apartment, reciting facts about myself to maintain my grip on identity and reality. As 11:07 p.m. approached, the boundaries between worlds began to dissolve more dramatically. The walls of my apartment occasionally became transparent, revealing glimpses of hospital corridors beyond. I heard distant voices calling my name, Caldwell, Nurse Patterson, and others I didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all, I began to see another version of myself moving about the apartment. A Thomas Reynolds who looked exactly like me, but carried himself differently, with a calm confidence that bordered on arrogance. He didn't acknowledge me, as if I were the ghost rather than him. At exactly 11 p.m., a knock came at my door. I didn't answer. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. Then it stopped, and a key turned in the lock, a key I hadn't given to anyone. The door swung open to reveal Dr. Edwin Caldwell, looking exactly as he had in the hospital, and beside him, the version of myself I'd been glimpsing all day. "It's time, Mr. Reynolds," Caldwell said. "The integration is nearly complete. You need only accept it now." "I won't go back there," I insisted, backing away. "Whatever you did to me, I reject it. This is reality, not your hospital." My doppelganger smiled, that same bemused smile I'd seen in Reflections. "We already went back," he said in my voice. "We've been working with Dr. Caldwell for 26 years. What you're experiencing is merely the echo of resistance, the final fragment of consciousness that refuses to accept the transition." "That's impossible," I whispered. "It's 1923. The hospital closed in 1897. Time is fluid at the threshold," Caldwell explained patiently. "What feels like days to you has been decades for your integrated self. He's become quite valuable to our work." My doppelganger, or was I his, approached me with an expression of sympathy. "It's less frightening once you accept it," he said. "Fighting only prolongs the disorientation." As he reached for me, I noticed something chilling. His hand passed through mine, incorporeal as mist. I wasn't being haunted. I was the ghost. "No," I backed away. "I'm real. I'm Thomas Reynolds." "Yes," my other self agreed. "We both are. But only one version can continue to exist in each reality." The walls of my apartment faded completely now, revealing the familiar corridor of St. Augustine's 5th floor. Nurse Patterson waited nearby with a wheelchair. In it sat an elderly man with vacant eyes and slack features, connected to tubes and machines that hadn't existed in 1923. With sickening clarity, I understood. That withered body was mine, the original Thomas Reynolds who had entered St. Augustine's 26 years ago. Whatever consciousness I now possessed was a fragment, preserved somehow in the hospital's twisted reality, experiencing an endlessly looping version of those fateful days while my actual body aged and deteriorated under their care. "Time to let go," my doppelganger said gently. "The loop has served its purpose, teaching us how consciousness can be partitioned across realities. But now we need you fully integrated for the next phase." He extended his hand again. This time, when our fingers touched, I felt a jolt of recognition. Memories that weren't mine yet were. Decades of working alongside Caldwell, learning to manipulate the threshold, preparing for what they called the grand integration. "What are you planning?" I asked, my voice fading like a radio losing signal. "The membrane between worlds has grown too thin," Caldwell answered. "Soon, it will rupture entirely unless managed properly. The church tried to stop our work, not understanding that closure without proper sealing would only accelerate the deterioration. We're going to repair it," my other self explained. But first, we need to be whole again." I looked at the wheelchair, at the empty shell I once inhabited. Was that to be my fate? Trapped in a failing body while my consciousness served Caldwell's mysterious purpose. "I won't help you," I said, summoning my remaining strength. "Do whatever you're planning. It ends now." With those words, I lunged not for the door, but for the nearest window. If I was truly a fragment of consciousness untethered from physical form, perhaps I could escape the hospital's influence entirely. The glass shattered around me as I fell through, expecting to plummet 5 stories to the street below. Instead, I found myself suspended in a void between realities, neither in the hospital nor in the New York I knew. Here, I could see the thin membrane Caldwell had described, a luminescent barrier stretching infinitely in all directions, pulsing with points of light where it had grown dangerously thin. I understood then what Caldwell hadn't told me. St. Augustine's wasn't just built on a threshold. It was the threshold, a physical manifestation of the membrane itself, designed to allow controlled passage between worlds. And it was failing. Through the thinning barrier, I glimpsed what waited beyond. Entities that defied description, pressing eagerly against weakening points, seeking entry into our reality. Caldwell wasn't trying to repair the membrane. He was preparing to open it completely. In that moment of clarity, I made my choice. If I was truly a fragment of consciousness with one foot in each reality, perhaps I could use that position to seal the threshold rather than open it. I pressed against the membrane, focusing all my will on reinforcing rather than penetrating it. The barrier responded, rippling around my incorporeal form, drawing energy from my consciousness to strengthen itself. From somewhere distant, I heard Caldwell's shout of rage and my doppelganger's cry of pain. We were still connected. What affected one affected all versions of Thomas Reynolds. The membrane pulsed brighter as I poured more of myself into it. I felt my identity dissolving, memories fragmenting as my consciousness was absorbed into the barrier itself. My last coherent thought was the hope that I was sealing the threshold rather than tearing it open further. Then, nothing. 3 months later, a demolition crew arrived at St. Augustine's Memorial Hospital. The city had finally approved its destruction after decades of legal limbo. As wrecking balls struck the facade, workers reported strange phenomena, tools that moved on their own, voices from empty rooms, reflections that didn't match their sources. By sunset, the foreman halted work, claiming the building was structurally unsound. The crew returned the next morning to find the hospital exactly as it had been before demolition began, untouched, unscathed, as if the previous day's work had never happened. The city tried 3 more demolition attempts. Each failed in increasingly inexplicable ways. Finally, the property was declared a historic landmark, preserved but never to be entered, surrounded by a high fence with prominent warning signs. As for Thomas Reynolds, he was never seen again after entering the hospital on November 14th, 1923. His apartment was found abandoned, a half-finished manuscript on his desk detailing bizarre claims about St. Augustine's Hospital. Medical authorities dismissed it as the ravings of a disturbed mind. Yet to this day, visitors to the fence surrounding the hospital sometimes report seeing a man in 1920s clothing watching from various windows. A man whose reflection doesn't always match his movements. And in nearby buildings, mirrors occasionally show glimpses of hospital corridors that don't exist in physical space, where doctors and nurses with not quite human features attend to patients who check in but never check out. If you want to hear more whispers from the darkness, follow this channel. The next story may be closer than you think.